Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. This week, global leaders gathered in New York for the annual United Nations General Assembly. Some of the highlights included an angry NATO pushing back on Russia, not only for the invasion of Ukraine, but also the recent provocations and violations of its airspace. NATO has clearly communicated that Russian jets and drones will be shot down if they violate NATO's airspace once again. Meanwhile, Donald Trump seems to have made a U-turn on his stance towards Ukraine. The U.S. president said that Russia is a paper tiger and that Ukraine can win back all of its territory. In his UN speech, the U.S. leader also said that Europe must stop buying Russian oil and gas if they want the U.S. to support secondary sanctions. We'll dig deep into these issues and more with our guests, but first let's take a look at this report from Ukraine. The United Nations General Assembly became the stage this week for Western leaders to rally behind Ukraine's war effort. President Trump vowed Ukraine would win all of Ukraine back, signaling robust U.S. support in a Zelensky meeting, including NATO arms deals and new sanctions on Russia.
I'm very dissatisfied with what Russia's doing and what President Putin is doing. I haven't liked it at all. He's killing people for no reason whatsoever. And they are doing very poorly.
Zelensky warned of an AI-driven arms race, urging global action to stop Putin's expansion into Georgia and Moldova.
None of this would have happened if Putin had not started this full-scale aggression, full-scale war. And every year that this war goes on, weapons become even more deadly. And only Russia deserves to be blamed for this.
European leaders like Macron and Starmer pledged energy and defense aid to counter winter threats. Russia's Sergei Lavrov, meanwhile, hit back, accusing NATO of waging a proxy war via arms and patrols near Kaliningrad, calling Trump's stance escalatory. Analysts see Moscow's rhetoric as a bid to deflect battlefield losses amid stalled talks. Russia launched a massive wave of drone and missile attacks this week, targeting cities like Dnipro, Kyiv, and Odessa, damaging homes, power grids, and infrastructure. The strikes, among the war's largest, killed and injured civilians and hit close to a nuclear power plant, raising international concerns. Ukrainian air defenses, supported by Western systems, intercepted many of the incoming projectiles, limiting some of the destruction. In response, Ukraine conducted drone strikes deep into Russia, hitting oil refineries and military targets, disrupting fuel supplies and damaging important assets. Russian forces mounted a series of aggressive assaults this week across the Donetsk Frontline, focusing heavily on the strategic hub of Pokrovsk in an attempt to break through Ukrainian lines and disrupt vital supply routes. Employing small unit infiltration tactics, including motorcycles and covert maneuvers, Russian troops made limited gains in the areas northwest of the city. However, Ukraine's defenses stood strong, repelling the majority of the attacks and inflicting significant casualties on the advancing forces. In adjacent areas like towns of Liman and Donetsk, Ukraine thwarted additional Russian probes, securing positions and regaining small stretches of territory. And now joining me to discuss the latest in and around Ukraine is Peter Dickinson, editor of the Ukraine Alert blog at the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Peter, great to see you. Thanks for joining us again on Ukraine This Week.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
Yes, now it's been a big week. There's been several developments on several fronts, but I think let's go ahead and start off in New York. We saw all these speeches at the UN General Assembly, but in my mind, one of the biggest things that happened this week is what Donald Trump has said, that Ukraine can actually win back all of its territory. It seems like a major turning point for the U.S. president. Do you think it'll hold?
Well, I think you're quite right. Yeah, it was Trump stole the show with his tweet, as he often does, and I think it was a significant moment because of the change in his position, the change in his stance on the war. Now, I think it's important to underline that he didn't actually change America's policy here. There was no suggestion that America itself would increase its aid for Ukraine or would increase sanctions against Russia. On the contrary, Trump was very clear that he saw Ukraine being able to succeed in the war with the support of, as he specifically mentioned, Europe and NATO. America's role will be, as he foresees it, will be to sell the weapons to Ukraine via Europe. And so that's been his policy for some time, and he underlined that. So we're not really talking about a policy shift here. On the contrary, Trump was really underlining the fact that America's taking a step back from direct aid, and it will simply be the salesperson here essentially will be selling Ukraine the weapons via Europe. But nevertheless, I think it's very significant that he has turned around and said now he thinks Ukraine can win. Just like a few months ago, we heard from Trump that Ukraine didn't have any cards, that Ukraine was, Zelensky was in danger of losing his country, that the Ukrainian situation was effectively hopeless, that Ukraine would have to make a deal and would have to make concessions to the Kremlin. And so now him turning around and saying, actually, Ukraine can win this, can actually retake all of territory, suggests a significant shift that will have implications, presumably, for the kinds of weapons they're ready to sell, the quantities of weapons they're ready to sell to Ukraine, and also in other areas where America is supporting Ukraine in terms of intelligence and other factors where they are still providing significant support. So it's definitely a change in tone, a change in mood, and I think it reflects the realities on the ground as Trump sees them. He's clearly been given the intelligence from his team that is telling him that Russia's not winning this war. On the contrary, Russia's military is struggling in Ukraine, and Russia's facing very, very difficult economic situation domestically as well.
Yes, some very good points you made there. Going back to the aid and the sanctions, so yeah, absolutely correct that the United States in no way is going to be sending free weapons to Ukraine, calling on Europe to do it as this is a European problem. But looking at 3 decades of free riding in the sphere of the military spending here in Europe, I mean, I understand just as well as anybody that it's an unfortunate time that the U.S. president now says, hey, guess what, Europe, you're on your own, or you have to take care of this mess. But he does have a point there, and I'm wondering now, the next question, is Europe up to the challenge to go ahead and pull out all the stops to provide exactly what Ukraine is going to need to take back its territory, something that very few, if no experts, have been talking about for the last several months, that Ukraine and there would be some kind of military solution to ending this war?
Well, that's the big question now. I think now we know that America, at least Trump says, is prepared to continue selling weapons. The big question now is Europe prepared to buy those weapons and in insufficient quantities? That's really it's an economics matter. It's a matter of the numbers. One would hope that now, Europe's had so many wake-up calls over the last few years, it's become a bit of a cliche. But one would hope now that, with America saying, we're out of the game of arming Ukraine simply in the form of aid. We're not going to do that anymore. This is Europe's problem. Europe's got to bankroll this war. And at the same time, we have Russia escalating its very provocative acts against Europe. We have the drones in Poland. We have jets in Estonia. We have unidentified drones disrupting the activities at Copenhagen and Denmark, the airport, and also the airports in Norway. So there's a lot. Europe is really being scared essentially from both sides, from the Russians and the Americans, to say, you've got to act, and that now is the time. So if they don't act soon, it's really hard to have any sympathy with the Europeans. This is clearly the time to step up. And if they don't act, if they don't step up and support Ukraine, there is a real danger that Russia could succeed in Ukraine, that eventually that the Ukrainians could simply be worn down. If that were to happen, Putin would have control of, obviously, his own army. He'd also control the Ukrainian army, so the 2 largest armies in Europe by far, the 2 most combat competent armies, the most experienced armies in Europe by far. And Europe would have to face him then. And I think that would be a very, very difficult proposition for the Europeans, and they surely know that. So really, the question for the Europeans now is, do you want to support Ukraine today, or do you want to face Russia tomorrow? And I would say that the answer is self-explanatory. It's obvious. But as I say, there's been a lot of wake-up calls in this war. I'm not fully convinced that all of Europe has woken up yet. So now is really the last call, as it were.
And in all fairness, the United States also has to take similar considerations, throwing tens of billions of dollars at this problem while allowing Ukraine to spill its own blood and fight this war is very different than if we have, an attack on NATO and American boots on the ground as a backstop further down the line. Now, I'd like to also talk about sanctions. That's also something that President Trump pointed out in front of the entire General Assembly there in New York, saying that it's absolutely bonkers that, Europe, after 3.5 years of war, has actually, if we look at the statistics, Europe has bought more oil from Russia than it's given in aid, whether that be military or financial assistance to Ukraine. And, why is Europe so dependent on the United States to put secondary sanctions on China, on India, if the problem can't even be dealt with here on the continent? The Europeans can't stop buying Russian fuel.
Well, this has been a problem for many, many years. And in many respects, Europe's addiction to Russia's energy exports is what's made Putin. It's certainly what's created his war machine and what has allowed him to wage this major war in Ukraine. So in a sense, Europe has created the threat that now looms over them. And I think the problem here is, there's no single authority in Europe that could have stepped in and say, okay, we've got to stop this. And every individual country has simply looked out for their own self-interests. For many of them, they have a very profitable trade with Russia for energy supplies. And I'm sure there's lots of very lucrative relationships there on an individual level as well. So we have countries like Hungary and Slovakia, but others as well, who are getting a lot of energy supplies from Russia. And there's some countries have even increased their dependency on Russia since the full-scale invasion began 3.5 years ago. So it's a major issue. And again, I think America has a good point here when they say, look, you want us to step in and do X, Y, Z. You want us to provide the military aid, you need to do that yourself. You want us to impose sanctions, you need to do that yourselves as well. Europe's really got to step up there, and they've got to get tough, got to get even tougher. I think I would say in fairness that Europe has made significant progress in some aspects, certainly in terms of Russian gas. They've cut down a lot, but they're still talking about 2026, 2027. It's very, very slow. There needs to be more of a sense of urgency here because the Russians are not waiting. The Russians are moving forward. They're clearly already probing Europe militarily, and the time is now for that. We can't wait another 1 or 2 or 3 years to cut the supply, the financing of Russia's war machine.
Yeah, and at current, it looks like Ukraine is doing the best at putting sanctions on Russian oil. And I hope to get to that. Let's get to that in a minute. But let's pivot right now to President Zelensky, some of the things that he was talking about at the Security Council, talking about drones, unmanned warfare systems becoming available to countries around the world. This could be a major game changer in global security, since these cheap drones can really accomplish some very explosive and, they can accomplish essentially what big militaries could in the past. Is this a new, method of warfare that the world is still not yet prepared to face? And I mention that in a very broad perspective because I think we can see, some of these systems being used in domestic capacity, which could make acts of terrorism or domestic terrorism also a major concern moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. We are talking about a new era here. This has been, the war in Ukraine has been transformative. We've seen a massive increase in the use of drones. Around 80% of all the frontline casualties on both sides now are being inflicted by drones. whereas in the past it would have been predominantly artillery. Artillery still plays a role. Tanks still play a role. Aircraft still play a role. But overwhelmingly now, what we've got in Ukraine along the front lines is this kind of kill zone of 10 or 20 kilometers on both sides of the line of contact, a sort of band where drones are constantly flying overhead, and anyone who pokes their head above ground or appears is likely or potentially to be struck by a drone. So it's a very new threat, and I think Zelensky's point about how accessible these technologies are, how relatively cheap they are. Of course, you can't imagine a small terrorist group putting together a ballistic missile in a garage somewhere. But they could conceivably put together drones and arm them with explosives and fly them into, a stadium or an airport or wherever it may be. So clearly there are obvious massive military ramifications here that are really transforming the battlefield. And there's also ramifications for domestic security. These drones are cheap. They're widely available. A lot of the drones initially that were used by both Ukraine and Russia, certainly I know from the Ukrainian side, a lot of them were just commercially available drones that were basically MacGyvered, that were basically repurposed to be used militarily. So that could apply for anyone. And we're talking about drones that cost a few $1,000s in some cases. These are not hugely expensive or hugely complicated kit. And so, the implications are very, very wide-ranging for security in general. And from a military point of view, they've really transformed the battlefield. And Ukraine uses drones at sea as well very effectively, and also long-range drones for strikes deep inside Russia. So it's had a huge impact on this war. And this is, to many degrees, the world's first drone war. And it's not going to be the last. We're going to see a lot more of this.
Absolutely. Now, Zelensky also in an interview with Axios there in the United States, earlier he had alluded to a request that he made of Donald Trump for some sophisticated weapons. We were wondering what that is. Reports today, on Friday, today is Friday, indicate that they are cruise missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles. And later in this Axios interview, President Zelensky said something very ominous to those who occupy the Kremlin, that they need to know where the bunker is, effectively saying that he would target the Kremlin. Is this more of a grandiose statement for propaganda purposes, or do you think that if Ukraine had the ability, they would really truly unleash a strike directly on the Kremlin?
No, I think that was just a headline-grabbing statement. Perhaps they would do some sort of a symbolic strike, but there would be no real purpose behind attacks on the Kremlin itself. It would be a very symbolic gesture at best. I think Ukraine's bombing campaign is very strategic. They clearly know what they're trying to hit, and they're hitting it. So they're hitting various different aspects of Russia's military-industrial complex. From oil refineries, pumping stations, ports, hubs, pipelines, also manufacturing plants, different aspects of the military industrial production lines, and railway logistics hubs, and so on and so forth. So they're very specific, and they have a clear idea of high value targets. I think any attack on the Kremlin would just be a symbolic gesture, essentially. Much like the Russians recently bombed the Cabinet of Ministers building in Kyiv, which didn't have any military value at all, but sent a message from the Russians that they were going to target Ukraine's government. But I don't think that would be it certainly wouldn't have a major impact on the course of the war.
Yes, but what is having a major impact on the course of the war seems to be these long-range Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries, pumping stations, export terminals. Since the beginning of August, we've seen significant attacks actually really starting to affect the Kremlin. We see fuel exports were suspended until the end of the month. That is now till the end of the year. There is at least 20% capacity, refining capacity that has been taken out. They're reporting fuel shortages in many areas, including occupied Crimea. Do you think that if Ukraine continues at the current pace that it's at, continuing to hit these very complex pieces of infrastructure, that this indeed is something that is going to tank the economy and put Ukraine on a much more stable footing when it comes to the defense of the country?
Well, this is, I would say, by far the most effective campaign that Ukraine has fought in the entire war in terms of damaging Russia and bringing the war home to Russia. You know, it's always been a problem that the war has been fought almost exclusively on Ukrainian territory, and Russia itself has been something of a safe haven. Now that's not the case, and Ukraine is demonstrating that it can hit targets all over Russia. I mean, certainly, you know, almost up to 2,000 kilometers deep inside Russia from Ukraine. So Ukraine's capabilities to strike long range have dramatically increased, and we see the effects. Russia's energy exports are down to levels they've not been since COVID. And of course, the entire global economy was in turmoil. We see fuel shortages across Russia in regions all over the country. There's no petrol. People are queuing up. They're not able to get there. In many places, they're not able to get petrol at all. In places where it is available, prices have reached record highs. So for the first time, I think, ordinary Russians in large numbers are becoming aware of the war and are being negatively impacted by the war. I think that's absolutely crucial here, because Putin has made it a priority to insulate the Russian public from the war, to make sure that they don't have any real negative impacts from what's going on, in order to make sure that there's no protest, or there's no domestic upheaval or no domestic opposition to the war. He's tried to protect them from any sort of impact whatsoever. Now, for the first time, a lot of Russians are starting to confront this lack of fuel, and that's having a very big impact on their daily lives. So it's already creating headaches for the Russians. We're talking around 20%, they say now, of refinery capacity is down. Ukraine has hit around half of Russia's refineries. Russia has around, I think, 38 refineries. Ukraine's managed to hit 16 of them in this last few months, many of those on multiple occasions. So it's a good start from a Ukrainian point of view. It's clearly having an impact on Russia's economy, on Russia's stability. Ukraine will have to keep going and escalate this campaign. I think one of the interesting things we should be looking out for would be bigger strikes using cruise missiles. Ukraine is developing its own domestic cruise missiles. They're expected to be produced in significant numbers by the end of this year. Now, at the moment, what we're seeing is mostly drone strikes, and they're having an impact. But if Ukraine can bring its own cruise missiles into the mix and start hitting these refineries and energy sort of hubs and ports with cruise missiles, which are far, far more explosive, then I think we could be talking about very, very serious economic problems for the Russians. As it is, it's already a significant success for Ukraine, but they need to keep the momentum up now and escalate these attacks. But I think it's also interesting to note that they clearly have a very good idea of how Russia's energy industry works, and they're being very, very surgical in their choice of targets and the way they're taking things out. So clearly they're working to a plan. It's going to be very interesting to see how this plan unfolds.
Yeah, it absolutely seems like a very, very good strategy that is being employed. And of course, cruise missiles, Tomahawks would also help hasten that a little bit. You know, Russia has come back and said that it is that it's already at war with NATO. And I'm wondering if these attacks, these successful Ukrainian attacks that are really causing a headache for the Kremlin in terms of the oil infrastructure, if this isn't partially the reason why Russia is testing NATO countries, such as Poland, Romania, Estonia, and others now that we know in the last couple days. Do you think that this, since the pressure is so strong right now on the Kremlin economically as well, that this is the reason why they're lashing out against NATO and trying to prod NATO? What do you think is behind Russia's attempts to, sow discord amongst NATO members and provoke the situation?
Well, I'm not sure it's connected to the attacks on Russia's energy industry. That may be a factor, but I think really what Russia's trying to achieve here is they're trying to intimidate NATO, and they're trying to signal to the Europeans that America will not support them. They want to demonstrate to the Europeans as forcefully as possible that Trump will not come to the rescue, that Trump cannot be relied upon, and therefore, they need to think twice before they continue their support for Ukraine. Ideally, what Putin, I would think, was looking to achieve is to have European countries start saying maybe we shouldn't get so involved with Ukraine because we are putting ourselves in the firing line here potentially. He's trying to scare them with these operations, these provocative gestures. These are acts rather, not gestures. Very specific acts, attacks. I would classify them as. I think he's been encouraged by. This is going back to before this week. Putin was certainly not encouraged by what Trump said this week, but prior to that, I think he's been very encouraged by Trump's general stance, by Trump's readiness to say, he doesn't necessarily commit to Article 5. You think it can be interpreted in different ways, that he'd let Russia do whatever it wants with countries that don't pay their way, that he wants to step back from European security, and so on and so forth. So I think he's been encouraged by that and said, okay, let's turn up the pressure on Europe now and let's demonstrate to them that America's not coming to the rescue, that they can't rely on America, so they need to be careful because we're America's far away and we're very close. So it's an intimidation tactic, essentially, and Putin's counting on Europe backing down. He's counting on them deciding, let's step back. I'm not sure that's a good bet from his perspective, because I think Europe is now really facing a very serious challenge and has to step up. But I think in the past he has been able to intimidate the West repeatedly. So it doesn't surprise me that he's now trying to use the same tactics again.
Yeah, now turning to Ukraine's front lines, it's rumored that a potential Ukrainian counteroffensive could be on the horizon. What do you think that looks like? Must look very different than the last counteroffensive that we saw in the summer of 23 with, heavy tanks and artillery and, your traditional weaponry. How do you think Ukraine, at this current point in the war, goes on a counteroffensive?
Yes, you're quite right. Yeah, I mean, the rise of the drones makes major operations very, very difficult. It's very hard to break through now, and it's very hard to concentrate forces in large numbers. So what we're seeing along the front lines now from both sides is, it's possible to infiltrate front lines with small groups of soldiers. The Russians, in particular, they use both. They have entire units now operating on motorbikes, on sort of cross-country motorcycles, where they literally buzz through the front lines. But those troops, once they're able to get through, once they get through, it's very difficult to then consolidate. You really need armor, you need tanks, you need armored vehicles, you need artillery to be able to get through and then hold territory. So what we saw recently, we saw a Russian breakthrough in August in eastern Ukraine, and at the time there was a lot of excitement on the Russian side and a lot of dooming on the Ukrainian side that perhaps this was a really decisive moment, a major breakthrough. Actually, now it looks like it was a trap, or at least from the Ukrainians, or at least it didn't work. Now those Russian troops who did break through have largely been surrounded and cut off. There's talk of a lot of Russian casualties, a lot of prisoners, and there's now a number of pockets of Russian troops who are reportedly cut off and now are being mopped up, as it were. So any Ukrainian counteroffensive would have to take this into consideration. How do you concentrate large numbers of troops? How do you get them through, and how do you hold territory? Honestly, I don't know. I don't think anyone knows at this point. We've not really seen any very effective offensive operations in this war for a long time now. So Ukraine will certainly be they'll certainly need the element of surprise, but that'll be the key thing. If they do launch a counteroffensive, how do you consolidate? Once you've gained some territory, how do you get the armor through there? How do you hold on to it? How do you consolidate and then bring up reserves and move them in? That's going to be very, very challenging. Frankly, I don't know how they're going to do it. I'm not convinced we're going to see major operations from the Ukrainian side. Let's wait and see.
Well, as we run out of time, do you think that this war is definitely going to go into 26, potentially into 27?
26, yes. Unfortunately, 27. Let's see. I mean, I think it can't go on. Wars don't go on forever. I think the most optimistic development from a Ukrainian perspective is certainly the attacks inside Russia on Russia's energy industry. That's Putin's Achilles heel. And Ukraine now has shown that it's able to strike it. And also, crucially, the Americans or other partners have not asked them to stop, which they did do previously. So if Ukraine can escalate that, then I think we have the potential where they can force Putin to the negotiating table. That may come, within months, even if Ukraine can escalate its attacks and can again bring cruise missiles into the mix. Other than that, if the war just goes on as it is mostly being fought in Ukraine, it could grind on for a very long time, and the odds there are in Russia's favour, frankly, as the far larger country which is prepared to accept those heavy losses. So Ukraine's trying to break through that model. They're trying to do something different, and at the moment, it seems to be working. Let's hope it continues.
Yeah, let's hope it continues. Peter Dickinson, editor of the Ukraine Alert blog at the Eurasia Center of Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for joining us on Ukraine This Week. Always appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Thank you for joining us, and join us again next week for the latest from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching again, and see you next time. Goodbye.